Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. This is Paul Talman with 9.connects, and you are in the right place if you are here for our webinar on cabling in Altium Designer, original off-label or harness editor Deluxe. We had a little bit of fun with that here with some AI drawings, but hopefully this will be as entertaining as the picture that we came up with here today. Just a quick housekeeping note. If you have any questions, feel free to write those questions in the question region of your GoToWebinar panel there. Behind the scenes is my colleague, Sean Kelly, though I'll be the one presenting here today. He is somewhat familiar with the harness editing tool, so he'll be able to answer some of those questions. Anything that we can't answer, and assuming we have enough time, I'm going to try to address those. If I cannot address them here, then we'll try to follow up, because there's a lot to cover here today. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to start off with our first polling question. Are you using Altium for harness design, whether it's what we call the off-label method or the new harness editor? So if you take a moment there, we'll get the poll open, and please give us a response. Here. And so, wow, over 3/4 of you here today have not used it, which will make my life a little bit easier because I'm going to be demonstrating the basics here. For those who have been using the off-label method, I'm pretty sure you're here to see what the harness editor is capable of doing. And those who are using the harness editor, hopefully I can show you a tip or two that are some of the things I have found that might help you out. But also in turn, if there's something I'm skipping or glossing or criticizing, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, you just need to do it this way, feel free to write that in the question panel so that we can correct ourselves here. So with that being said, I'd like to jump on here to our objectives. We have two of them here today. The first one is to discuss the difference between the off-label method and the new harness editor method. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on the harness editors in this webinar today. And then secondly, demonstrate the harness editor. So I'm just going to go through a couple of PowerPoint slides, and we'll get on to the good stuff over here, but I just using these slides to kind of organize what we're going to be doing here today. So there are really 3 editors, 4 if you want to include the BOM editor. There's the wiring editor, there's the layout editor, and there is the Draftsman capabilities. And these editors will look remarkably familiar to you because they're basically rehashes of the schematic editors and the Draftsman editor. They just changed it so that it will work in the context of what we're going to demonstrate here today. I want to talk about the off-label method for a moment so we can compare and contrast what's kind of going on, or at least you'll be able to see what's going on between the two. We did a webinar a couple of years ago, I believe it was in 2020, it was called Cabling in Altium Designer, and we explain all the nuances of doing what's called the off-label method. So why do we call it the off-label method? In short, it's because we're trying to use Altium Designer to do something it was never designed to do, or at least at that time. Now they've got the harness editor, now they've got the ability, but what we're trying to do is how do we make cables or harnesses in Altium Designer using what they've got available to us. So that's why we call it the off-label method. This method is kind of near and dear to me because it was designed by myself and a colleague of mine, Jeff Condit, who's done webinars in the past with us here at 9.connects. We discovered it, we cracked the code basically in 2012. So when both Jeff and I worked at Altium, and that was really between 2007 and 2011, we had tried to figure out how to make this work in Altium, along with several FAEs at Altium at the time. We couldn't figure it out, and we finally cracked the code, and that was that we had to separate the mechanical from the electrical, and that's how the off-label method works. And that's what you see over here. Is there's some things in here that are they're a part of the symbols, and we'll talk about this here in a moment, that happen to be a part of the mechanical element of this to make this come together, and there's parts of it that come to this over here. So for example, if we look at this, and I'm sorry, I'm not in Altium Designer, I was trying to zoom in, but this little Tyco component, which you're going to see here quite a bit, this one over here, it has actually several representations. You can see that we put a picture in there. There's the wiring or the symbol that we use for the wiring diagram. There's also some representations over here. So you have the side view and you have the front view of it as well. So that's how we work the off-label method, is we create components, and then we create those components. We make some of it so that it can work in the mechanical drawing, and some of it works in the wiring. So let's take a little closer look at this. The other thing that we're doing is everything is done in the schematic editor. So we're not shuffling something from the schematic editor into the PCB editor, though I was noodling about that the other day, and I think that could be possible based off of what I'm seeing in the new layout editor that the harness tool provides. But nevertheless, it all works just fine in the schematic editor. So everything is done in the schematic editor. So what are we doing? As I mentioned, we have the wiring diagram, we have the mechanical, but we also provide notes and instructions on here as well. And we provide the bill of materials. So why these two additional things in here? Because unlike the PCB, we're handing this off to somebody to build, and 99% of the time what you're designing over here is going to be something that's custom. Right? If you are going to build something like an HDMI cable, because your company happens to make HDMI cables, you're probably going to go through a very different method of preparing this and getting it into manufacturing, right? But if you're going to create something like this, which is very unusual, very unique to the project that you are working on, then there's probably going to be a handful of these things, and someone's going to be sitting at a table and they're going to be looking at this while they basically solder and press crimps and get this whole thing put together, right? So that's what makes it a little bit unusual, is that we've got to have additional information here in front of us that normally we would not bother with on the PCB side. A perfect example of that would be the bill of materials. We wouldn't bother putting that on the schematic, right? That's always been a separate sheet. But for something like this, where we want to keep everything consolidated for the assembler to put together, it makes perfect sense to have it on there. So we have to kind of work with what we've got over here, and that brings us over to the library side. So that connector that I talked about, the Tyco connector, this is what a typical part would look like in the library. Now, for us in the off-label method, anything that needs to show up in the bill of materials needs to be defined as a symbol. And you're going to see that there's some slight differences between this method and the harness method here in a few minutes. But since we're using the classic method, the classic method of Altium is that if you want this thing to be in the schematic editor and you want this to show up in a bill of materials, then you better define it as a component. And that's what we did here. So when we do this, we have three purposes when we create this. The first one is the physical. So these are the physical representations. And I am throwing the term physical and mechanical around kind of loosely that mean one and the same thing for our purposes here. The second part is the electrical. So if we want to set up our wiring diagram, there it is. The third part is what we'll call instruction or guidance. So since we need basically a call out, we add that into the part. And we also add in the line item here. So you can see this is where we can just drop in, so we can add it to the bill of materials on the schematic document. And lastly, we have a really nice picture too. And I'm going to tell you something, these pictures are really worth 1,000 words for the assembler. When they see what it is and they're looking at the kit that they've got in front of them and they can say, oh, this matches up with this, it saves the time and it also reduces mistakes as well. So anything you can add to it to make the assembler's life easier is always value add. Okay. And then lastly, you have to have a finer understanding of the finer points and limits of Altium's capabilities. So when we do these type of things, we have to be very strategic about how we do them, because they ultimately impact things down the road. So for example, one thing that we got really dialed in, for example, is this line item here. And if you'll notice here, it says equal BOM number, equal manufacturer, equal manufacturer's part number. These aren't parameters, these are actually text. And so if we set up the text appropriately and we redirect it, that's why there's an equal sign in front of it, we redirect it to the parameter, we just simply change the parameter, the value of the parameter, and voila, it's in there. So when we drop these things down, they're already filled in with their information because the parameters already have the information. So these are the little things that we had to learn to do in there. Now, if you want more information about the off-label method, then definitely take a look at this video, Cabling and Altium Designer. We go through all the nuances and things that you need to do in order to make this work, okay? Now, with that being said, let's take a look at the harness editor method. We got to start off with licenses, okay? And I want to make this clear. The last time during the prior webinar when we talked about the constraint manager, I made it about as clear as mud. Hopefully this time I'll explain it in such a way that will make perfect sense, okay? So in order to use the harness editor, you have to have either Altium 365 Pro or Professional, they call it one and the same, or Enterprise. Okay, so yes, when you buy Altium Designer, it comes with a 365, but that's not the Pro version. It's a basic version. There's a lot of features you get with the Pro, for example, revision control and lifecycle management and ECAD, MCAD integration. Harness editor is another element of that offering if you upgrade to the Pro or if you go to Enterprise. And Enterprise is really nothing more than Nexus, given really a new name, but has the same capabilities as what Nexus always was. All right. Now, if you do have A365 Pro or Enterprise, then that entitles you to a license called the Altium Designer Professional License. Okay? And what happens, because this is what happened with us here at 9.Connects, when I was trying to first learn the harness editor and I was first trying to get into the constraint manager, I couldn't get into it. I'm like, well, what's going on? We have the proper license because we had A365 Pro, but our rep did not upgrade us. Our license just said Altium Designer, not Altium Designer Professional License. And so once they looked and said, yes, you do have the Pro version, let me change that in your system on the on-demand licenses, and voila, we were able to go. So the short of it is you do have to have the Pro and the Enterprise, and the license that is listed in your, pretty much everybody uses the on-demand licenses, but that on-demand license has to be listed as Altium Designer Professional License. So hopefully I've made that clear about the licensing. The second part about the harness editor is that unlike the off-label where we just use one big happy schematic document or multiple schematic documents, they've got multiple editors. So you have a wiring, layout, Draftsman, and the BOM doc. And so I can summarize it by saying this, and you're going to see this here in just a moment. The wiring and the layout editors are basically they're built off of the schematic editor. So there's nothing that's going to be really unusual or wild about it except for what you're going to place. The Draftsman editor, same thing. It's going to look like the Draftsman editor. It's going to act like the Draftsman editor if you're familiar with on the PCB side. It's just that it's going to call up things that are specific to the wiring and the layout editors. And lastly, the BOM doc is going to look the exact same as well. But pretty much when you are going to create something in the harness editor, all of these need to be in play, okay? And with that, enough talking to the slides, let's actually go through the motions of this here. So I'm going to bail out of this. There we go. And I did an example up here for the moment, but we're going to start with a brand new project, which you see down over here. So what you see is a harness project.prj.har. As opposed to, for example, this project over here. So here's our off-label one. I'll bring it back. I'll bring this one up. This is the one we used in the webinar 4 years ago, the one you just saw on the screen. And this one would be done under PRJ PCB. But again, if you're using the harness editor, it's a PRJ HIR. Now, I've already set this up over here just so that we didn't have to spend the time for me splunking down my, my downloads directory to put this in the right place. But just to show you how you start it up, you go into File, New, go to Project, and again, if you have the license, you should see it here. Now, don't click on Harness, because I've done this a few times now where I click on Harness thinking that I've got a harness project, but until you click on Empty here, because I don't have any template set up for it at this point in time, you need to click on that, and then from there, you can put in your name in your folder. So it's pretty much setting it up the same way you can do any other project, just that you just want to make sure you click on your default over here. I wish it'd say default as opposed to empty, but yes, and what you can do is you can have, since this is all done in Altium 365, most of it's done in Altium 365, then here you can have a template saved up in 365 that you could use. It's similar to an example that we have here with the PCB, where we have a number of different projects that we, templates that we've set up. You can save it locally, or you can save it to your version control if you happen to have Git or SVN associated to your system, or you can use your cloud. And of course, in this case, we're using the 9.Connects A365 cloud. So I'm not gonna press create on this because I've already created this creature. So I'm just gonna press cancel. I just want to show you where you get this thing started. Now, with that being said, I'm gonna clear the boards here just so that we can kind of see what it looks like here from the very beginning. Once we've got our harness underscore PRJ, our harness underscore project.proj.har here, we can start adding our documents in there. So if you right click and you say add new the projects, you've got basically 5 flavors. I'm not going to talk about the out job here, but obviously the out job would work the same way as any other out job that they have. It would probably be more geared towards what they can offer within these other editors. But yeah, they do have an out job file. What they don't list here, which you can kind of sort of use, but I would kind of discourage it, is you can actually also use an SCH PCB, basically a symbol library. You can use it for at least connectors, but it's going to be very limited beyond that, and I'll explain why here in a few minutes. But what we're going to start off with was the very beginning, which is the harness wiring diagram. So we're going to bring this on up, and what does it look like? It looks like the schematic editor. It acts like the schematic editor, so that's a good thing, right? One of the things that I'm going to show you, and this is what I've learned about Altium, if you're trying to get your head wrapped around something new that they've added, especially if it's an editor, the best place where you can go is to go into the place menu and look at what they're offering you. Because in the end, if you think about it, and this is what I think confuses a lot of people who use like SolidWorks and other mechanical tools, they just have a bunch of things that they create, right? Where we actually are kind of driven by the primitives that are allowed for us to be used. We can't create new primitives, right? We can only use the primitives that Altium makes available to us. And even within the primitives, there are properties. We can't create new properties. We can only give values to the properties that already exist. So if you think of it or restrict yourself from that perspective, then the editor won't feel so so large and so unwielding at times. So that's what we're going to kind of do here is we're going to basically go through some of these features and I think that'll give you an idea of how to put things together. So the first way is through the part. Okay, so I'm going to click here on the part, and this does bring up the components panel. Now, as I mentioned, you can use an SEH lib to do this. I have put these components into our A365, and in a few minutes, I will kind of show you what I've done because it's important to understand how to put certain things in there because there's different ways of handling it depending on what you're trying to create. But let's just simply start with our connector first. So I'm going to type in Tycho here because that's what this one is. And I'm going to put this one in, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to do a place. So this thing is going to look exactly like any other symbol that you probably created for a connector. Here, I'm going to place this one down. And then I do have a part A and a part B for this. I still really like putting that picture in there. As I mentioned earlier on, it helps whoever's going to design this to see what this thing represents other than just a pretty yellow box with some numbers on it. So I'm going to click and drop this down here. I do need a second one, so I will, since it's on my cursor here, I'm going to hit my X key to flip it. I'm going to drop this one here, and I'll drop this one here, and I'm going to right-click to end. So I'm just going to do a simple point-to-point just to show the capabilities of this. Now, there's several ways to do this, by the way. So one of the ways to do this is I can always go in here and I can say, because I'm going to wire this now. And let's talk about the wiring. So the harness wiring, I can click on here. And I can, once I click on it, basically I draw a wire from point A to point B. If you're familiar with the schematic capture, you can also do your PW, which is the place wire, the hotkeys on your keyboard. And the classic way of taking this, if these really are one-to-one, you put it here and you pull them out. Voila, you've got your wires here. Now there's something interesting about these wires. So unlike the ones that we do in the schematic editor for PCBs, these wires are basically parts. And I don't know if I like that or not, but let me kind of explain what I mean by that. If we go over to the properties, you will see that there is a designator and there's a comment. So what does this look like? This looks like a component, right? You can have parameters in here, and yes, this will show up in a bill of materials, which makes sense because obviously all these things are physical things that we need to purchase to make this work, right? I don't know if I necessarily like the fact that these things can be created in the design here as opposed to in the library. I'm a big fan of the single source of truth. Now, with that being said, you can define wires, you can define cables in the library. I'll show you that here in a few minutes. But the fact that you can create these on the fly, it bothers me a little bit. Now, granted, if you're creating maybe one cable a year and you happen to have A365 Pro or Enterprise in it, you know, it's like you didn't buy it for the harness editors. Is kind of one of those things that gets thrown in there and you say, well, I'm going to use it. If I do one harness a year, then I suppose this would be fine. But if your company's going to do a lot of harnesses, I would really encourage all of this to be developed in the library and pushed over in the same fashion that we do things in the PCB environment. But nevertheless, it's here. Okay. So with all that grandstanding that I've done here, I'm going to do a left mouse click, and I'm going to sweep from right to left so I can select all of these here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a designator. So I'm going to do a W question mark. I am going to turn it on, and I'm also going to turn off the comment at this time. Okay? So I don't want those. So there you go. So these are all individual wires, and I'm going to move these over here, and you'll see why in a moment. My move select is not working today. Move. Okay. And this is, you're going to see little things like this. The editor is still under development in many ways. So unfortunately, just grabbing and clicking and dragging all these and moving them is not always sometimes it's persnickety. So I will, if you don't mind, I do want to move these because I'm going to need to move them for what I'm going to show next. And we will do that. Okay, so with those being moved out of the way, a lot of times you buy cables, those cables come with multiple wires in them. So let's say that I do have a cable that I have and they happen to have all these wires in here. That's not a problem. What I'm going to go back to is my place menu again, and I can do a harness cable. And so the harness cable here is this elliptical shape, and I'm going to click once and I'm going to click again. Now, unfortunately, the way this elliptical thing works is that it doesn't really give me the ability to really change the width or the height graphically. So I've got to just kind of put it down like this first. I'm going to right click to end it, and then I go into its properties to make some adjustments. Before I do that, just notice graphically that if this circle is out there and anything that it is touching, and all 5 of these wires, it is touching, at that point in time, you can say that this Altium knows that this cable primitive is touching these wires or associated with it. And you can see these over here. And I'm going to do a quiet annotation here in just a moment, just to show this list a little bit better. But this is a little bit bulky. Again, I don't have a mechanism here to just simply drag this and make it thinner. I do have to control that through the properties up here. So the width here, I'm going to make 200, and the height here is actually pretty good at 600, so I'm going to leave it like that. The other thing I'm going to do too is I'm going to change this to CB question mark, and I'm going to turn off the comment, and there we go. So that's it. I've got my wires going from point A to point B. I've got my cable, and my cable recognizes these 5 wires. I am going to do a silent annotation just to move this along. So I'm going to go into Tools, Annotation. Actually, it's not a silent, it's a quiet one. And I will say yes. I wish there was a silent one, which you would do automatically, but I'm doing this one that just updates it all. And there is basically my wiring, my cables. So there's a couple other features here that we should look at. If we go back into our place menu, you'll also notice that there is a splice. I'm going to forewarn you, Altium's a little bit splice happy. So when you start dropping things in, Altium is very quick to add a splice in there. But you can add it in on your own, and I will do that. And then there's my splice. Now, when you splice, the moment you splice, it immediately splits this wire off. Okay, so this wire goes over here, and so now the question is, you know, if this is the same wire, like where you're just tapping, you're soldering something on, but it's the same wire running through, you still can call this a W5. So let's say that in this case, I am running it through. I'm just tapping this wire off of this in a sense when I'm splicing it. There is a tap, but the tap handles it differently from a splice. I'm actually going to splice in another wire into this. So I'm not treating this as a separate wire. I suppose I could, if really I am cutting this and these are going to be 2 separate wires. Actually, let's just do it that way, and just to keep it proper here and realistic. So there's wire, there's 6, and just so as I noticed, again, it did break that wire once we did that. And I can do a place again of another wire. We'll click on this, drop it in, right click, basically the same way that you would put in a wire in the schematic capture. And this one I will label as W7. Excuse me, W7. Change this one here and turn this one off. So there is our wire. So what other goodies do we have in here? And I will move this one over just a touch, just so that it's not there. And I'll also turn off the comment here. It really loves turning on the, this one is a splice one, so I'll just call it SPL1. But I don't know if I'll display it. I'm going to just turn it off. So everything should have a designator to it, because ultimately it will propagate over into the Draftsman tool and into the BOM dock as well. But even the splice is treated as a component. If you go into the splice, what is it giving you? A designator. What is it also doing? It's allowing you to put parameters in here. Why do we need parameters? Parameters are for bills of material. So everything here that they're adding into this, for the most part, they will allow you to associate something real to it. Okay, so with this being said over here, let's go back into our place menu. Let's see, we talked about the splice. There's another one called the tap. So if there's a way that you want to somehow add something in there so you can put a probe into it, or that you would have the ability to put a future wire into it, you can add this tap in there. I will throw this one up here like so, and that's what it does. I've now right-clicked to end it. And like everything else, I need to kind of give it something here. So I'm going to call this tap 1. I am going to turn this off, but there's your tap. But now again, because I've dropped this in here, Altium is recognizing this as possibly 2 wires. In this case here, I will call this one W1, okay, because it's just a continuation. I'm just tapping it. All right, What other goodies do we have in here? Let's look into the place menu again. We have a shield with connections. So sometimes we want to add something above and beyond, we can do it. So there's two shields. There's one with a connection and one without. So I just want to show you what this looks like. This one basically allows you to, if you're going to run ground, so that means, like, you know, if you're going to do some type of grounding where you got pins dedicated on one or both of the connectors to add ground, you can use this one. The one I will use for this, not that there's any difference other than just the fact I want to use the one without the connection. I'm just going to use the shield, and I'm going to drop this one in. And again, very similar to the issue that I kind of had with the CV1 over here. I've just got to go in here and give it a little bit of a trim. So the width is 200 and the height should be 6. And there it goes. This designator, let's just call this SLD1. I'll make that one visible. And there it is. Okay. So that's how you'd add in a shield if you wish to have the shield in there. What other goodies do we have in here? There's a twist. Twist works pretty well too. So really it's just a matter of it touching wires. And that's the key thing you see here is that, I'm just going to go back for a moment. With the cable, it shows you all the wires that are associated with the shield. When you click on it, it shows you all the wires associated with it. Notice that 1 and 6 are not associated with it. Okay. So just be aware of that. Let's see, let's go back into our twist. So this, if you want to twist it, you can add it in, but just like the shield and the CV, there's some post work you'll have to do with this. Let's say I want to twist 4 and 6, so I know that'd be a little bit, that'd be pretty unusual. Actually, let's just do 3 and 4 because that'd be a little more realistic. So I want 3 and 4. So again, it's kind of giving me these commands to drop it, but I've got in the wrong place, so I will move it up. And let's see if we can get just 3 and 4. Now, again, if you're having some issues like this is where you kind of say, well, okay, I can maybe adjust the width and the height. I'm not a big fan of the width being what it is. I'm going to change it to 100. This is during practice sessions here. Now, as for the height is okay, but I'm dealing with the grid issue. So, and you'll see this, by the way, in the off-label method. Get used to using the 50 mil grid. I'm going to hit the key, the G key, so I get to 50 mils, and then I'm going to move this accordingly, like so. Now it's just saying twist 3 and 4. The designator on this one, let's just call it TWT1, and I'm going to hide it. But again, make sure the designator is given to all of these things. What other goodies do we have in here? In the place menu, we have a no connect. The no connect could be for wire, and it's also could also be for pins as well. So you may have a situation where you just want this wire to dangle off here, and that wherever this harness is going to be used, then at that point in time, it'll be connected to whatever chassis or to whatever other device it's going to be connected to. But for the moment, you just call it to be a wire that has no further connection. That's just to appease some of the rules that Altium provides. And lastly, there's also a wire break too. So this is a nice way of saying I want to use multiple sheets. So if you've got something that's got like 90 pins or 200 pins, you want to break up into multiple sheets, this is how you'd communicate between those sheets. The rest of the stuff that you over here is your typical non-electrical drawing features that you would come to expect in any of the schematic type editors in Altium Designer. Okay. So there it is. We've created this monster over here. Now let's talk about a few other things because I want to get into the libraries here for a few minutes. What about things like crimps? What about accessories to this here? So in the off-label method, every one of those accessories would have been created as a separate component with its own symbol. We don't really do that here in the harness editor. So let's go into this component here. If we go in here and we look at its properties, you'll see this general, you'll see pins, and this is pretty typical for any type of component that's in the schematic. But then you get in this thing called cavities, and cavities is where you would want to introduce your crimps, okay? And so that's where this is. Now, I'm not necessarily sure why you're not giving me that permission. There we go. No, you're not going to give me any crimps, huh? Let me move the shield over and see if that's causing anything there. I'm logged in. Let's try 2A and see if 2A will be more magical for me. Add. So I'm not sure why I've got something blocked off here. I'm going to drop one more component in here and see if I can, if it's something not associated with this, but something associated here. If not, I'll go to my other drawing. We can look at it from that point of view. So I'm going to do a right click here and let's do a placement. Let's drop that in here. I'm going to right click to end it. Let's click in here and double click in here to get its properties. Go to cavities, add not a happy camper for some reason. Okay, I'll show this here in the other design instead of trying to debug it since my time is short. Let me bring up this one here. Okay, so here is my, this is the design. This is the, basically what I did is I took the off label and put it into the harness design to see if I could mimic it. So let's go to P1 because this one does have crimps to it. So if I double click into here and you go into the cavities, you will see that all of these have been assigned. In order to assign it, you do have to go to add, you have to do crimp. And again, I'm not sure if I have a licensing thing going on, but nevertheless, it'll show crimp. But here's the thing that happens. When you do this, the only thing that I can do is I can only pull from the from Altium 365. It will not allow me to put in some part choice. It's not going to allow me to pull from an external library. So if I want to add these things in, they must be defined within the library. Okay? In particular, the one that you store in Altium 365, not an external one like an SCH file. Okay? But that's how you would add these in. So that takes me to that point. Hopefully I'll be able to get to it here because that's going to be kind of important. Let's go here into our Explorer panel. And it's pulling up on my other screen. Once it's up, I will bring it over and you'll see it here. Make sure I don't have anything. There we go. So let's bring this up. So I'm in the navigation panel here, and I'm going to go to a folder we call Proving Grounds. This is where I do all my experiments. So if there's things I need to try, this is where I kind of do those. You can see I've got my harness components here. So I have my harness components, and in Altium A365, they are handled pretty much the exact same way you create any other component, but there are some exceptions, and I want to bring those to your attention. All right. You'll see that there's harness components and there's symbols as well. There's also footprints as well. So with the new harness editor, if I want to do a layout, what they call the LDR.doc, then I can also add a 3D body into it here. So let's take a look at this one. So this is a really good example. Here's a Tyco part. I'm gonna right click and open this for editing. Hopefully allow me to edit. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing those parts in the properties, but nevertheless, it does allow me to open it. So you would set this up, these components up generally the same way you can set up any other component. You have to define it in the component editor. So I put the name, gave a description, manufacturer's name, manufacturer's part number. I probably could find a part choice for this as well. I could add data sheets to it as well. What you see over here is your typical symbol. There is a part A and there's a part B. Okay, so same way you create any other symbol. Here, and I will open this for review. So let's click on this. What you do is you basically add the same number, whatever number of pads you, whatever number of pins you have, you add the same number of pads to this, and they just need to be pads. I think even surface mount pads would work fine. You don't have to in any way, shape, or form align these to the actual pins. You just need to put them in there so that Altium has some pin pad reference to this. And then the rest of it is just putting in a step file. So if I hit my 3 key over here, you can see this was added in here. In fact, I don't even know where those 5 got buried, but I didn't have to put them on the edge over here as such. It's all you need to do for the harness editor is to give it the symbol and then create a footprint, drop in the same number of pads you have for pins, and then drop in your step file and or you can draw it through your 3D bodies, and you're good to go. Okay. So that's that there. I'm going to close this here. And this one's all set up. Now, let's take a look at another one because there's some other things here. I'm not going to save this change, and I'm going to bring this back up here. Another one to take a look at, I'm going to show you the cable first because the cabling is a different creature. So you can see that when we created this Belden wire here, you'll see that it saves it over here. And if I double click into this, it will allow me to make the edit. But let's say I'm going to create a new one. I want to create a new wire, and you can do that. You can just draw one little wire, give it a different color, give it fill in the component information here, and you're done with it, but you can save it. So you'll notice that there's an area down here that says add harness wiring. You can say new. If you do this, there's only 2 things you can really do here. You can basically do your cables and you can do your wires. So in the place menu, you can see that over here, there's nothing for pins. So if you're trying to create a connector, this is not the route to go. You've got to go through the classic symbol route to do it. And then from there, you can draw it out. Okay. And again, since I'm pressed for time, I'm not going to go through the motions of creating that right now. But once you've got that drawn out, that's all you need. And again, you put your component information in there and you would save it off. And if we close this over here and go back, no, do not save. and we go back over here to this one over here, you can see the one that I did create, which is this. And then you can just simply place it from the library, and it works pretty well. The last one that I want to show you, this is where it gets kind of interesting. I was experimenting with this. When it comes to things like crimps, housing, jack screws, anything that you have to buy that really goes above and beyond what I've shown you so far, then yes, you do need to define it in the component or A365 as a component. But what I'm finding is that the more you try to add over here, the bigger problems you're going to have later on the layout side. So for this microfit, let's take a look at this. This is basically a crimp, okay? And if we go here and we do an edit, yeah, let's just open this one up. In fact, I wanted to fix this, so I might as well fix this while it's here. So I added this in because in the off-label method, this is how we do it. But if you actually look at what we've got here in the wire demo, you'll see that when you add a crimp in here, Altium automatically adds a symbol in. So basically it's saying you don't need the symbol. And what happened was is that when I did add this in and I pushed it over to the layout, it actually creates it as yet another connector. When you get to a layout diagram, anything that's got a pin on it is effectively treated as a connector. And that becomes really problematic. So what I want to do here is I'm actually going to remove this. And this is really weird, right? Because most of the time, we've never had that. It's like if you create a component and you don't have a symbol for it, we can't use it in our editors. However, the way they're doing it with the harness editor, because you're treating it as an element of a property of another component, we can get away without not having a symbol. So what you see over here is complete. I don't need to do any more with this. So I am going to I'm going to save this. Actually, I'll go through the motions here really quick. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to say save to server, and I'm just going to say that I remove the symbol, and that will remedy that. So let's go back to our project that we've got over here. So we have a wiring diagram. I'm going to do some saves here. And just simply put, I'm going to keep this, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to do this over here like that. And I'm going to do a save, and I'm just going to keep the name. All right. And let's do that save here too. So I was going to do both of them. There we go. That's kind of all I want to say about this, because again, I'm looking at my time here, and I know I'm pressed and a lot more I need to show you. But I'm going to right click on this, and I'm now going to go and say add new to project, and let's take a look at the harness layout drawing. So there you go. Looks like the same sheet as before. So again, we're kind of in a schematic-like environment, even though they call it the layout. The placement is a little bit different here. Okay. Now, how do we take information from our wiring diagram and get it into this here? We simply go into design, we import the wiring diagram, and that's pretty much what they give you. Okay, so yes, they give you some things over here so that it recognizes it. So there is a netlist behind the scene, but not that fancy ECO stuff that we normally use when we go from the schematic to the PCB side. All right. And what you've got over here are just basically your two connectors. But at this point, we're not dealing with individual wires. They want to show this from a harness point of view. So we pull this out over here. And then at that point, what we'll do is we will go in and we'll just simply place our harness bundle, and we connect from point A to point B. So again, you've got to look at it from a more of a general connection point of view, whether it's wires or cables. It's just considered to be a harness. So you're going to go from point A to point B. Now, some interesting things we do over here. First off, I am going to call this one CB1. I was kind of surprised that they don't have something that just drops this down. It says, well, here's CB1. I will do this. Also, you'll notice that the wire bundle is showing 2, 3, and 4. I got to be honest with you, I'm not sure what's going on there, because obviously 1 and 5 are still a part of this, even though there was a tapper, there was a splice that was done to it here. But if I go into this here, I believe I might be able to remedy this. So this does recognize pins 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It looks like, oh, there we go. So then we can add these other objects in there too, depending on which side they're going to, so that I can add those in, and that should update the cable accordingly. Okay, probably be helpful if I split the screen here and did a look for this. But for what I wanted to show over here, there's just a couple other things before we move on to Draftsman. First off, one thing that is driving me a little bit bonkers is this length. The length is something you probably provide automatically. Unless I'm missing and someone can explain to me how this works, I can only do this in mils. Now, I'm a huge fan of mils. I've written a paper about why I like mils more than millimeters, but not in a design of this nature. I would have expected at least centimeters, possibly a meter, right? Or a fraction of a meter, or at least inches. But for some reason, I cannot get this thing to convert. And so they're doing it in mils, which I think is kind of, most of the time you run like a 3-foot cable. So I don't think I want to say 36,000 mils. But that's just me. Again, if someone knows a better way to do this, pipe in, I'd like to know how to do that. So there is that feature there. The other element of this is some of the other the menu placements here. So the harness covering, so I can click on this if I want to show that there's going to be a sheep on this. All right, I can add that in here. I can also place a connection point. So if I did want to drop that at the additional, I'd have to do this where I was going to represent off that other wire here, where I do the place, and I would do the harness bundle again. So there's a wire that's hanging off of this like so, right? And I would have to define this as that being that wire 6 or 7. And then lastly, the placement of the layout label. So the label would be put up over here. Just one note about the label. If it's a multiple line label, because the company I worked with at one point had they had 3 lines you could put. So if you want to do this, you could say like line 1, try that again, line 1. You can hold down your Alt key, hit enter, and then you can continue line 2, Alt key, enter, line 3. And then once you click off of there, you'll see your label like this. And like everything else that I've added in over here, these things can be added in as BOM items because they have a designator and they also have parameters as well. Okay? So just be aware of that. All right, with that being said, and again, I'm really trying to keep on time over here. What I want to do is I'm going to add another feature. I'm going to save this and I'm going to go over here. All right, call this that. That sounds good to me. And on the project here, we're going to add the next thing in. When you do this, you have to add in the BOM doc or you won't get far with the Draftsman. So we're going to go add new to project, active BOM, and it's just going to pop up and it's going to look at everything in the project. And that's all we need it for really for the purposes of this demonstration once it's there. And these are the things that I've got in there. And there's some things that are not managed because yes, I drew them either from directly in. You can see the one thing I did add in, which is this here. So pretty much everything else I added in here was drawn in there. That's why they're not managed. Okay. Let's go back into here. Let's save this so it knows it. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And then the last thing, which I think is really very useful, if you do add new to project, let's go to the Draftsman here. Now, of course, you can now add templates in here, which I would encourage you to use if you're going to do this. For now, I'm just going to use the default blank. I'm going to press OK. So what can you do with this? Pretty much what you'd kind of expect that you could have done on the PCB side. The major ones is that you can add the wiring diagram and the layout diagram. So just to demonstrate this, you drop this in, and voila, it's done. Hopefully you're familiar with the Draftsman editor because it's going to act the same way here. I will add in a new sheet because I want to show the features I think are pretty useful here. Okay. Once Altium responds, there we go. And let's do a add new sheet. So on this sheet, on this one here, I'm going to zoom that in, and I'm going to add in the ones that I think are going to be extremely useful. And that is going to be your wiring list. Okay. So here's your wiring list. And by the way, for the color coding, and I'll show this one in the demonstration one in a moment. If you've got these color coded and I don't, they'll show you the colors, which is really neat. And then lastly, the connection table. The connection table is okay. It's just really 2 different ways of looking at it. So it's like what pin and what part, and what's the designator, where this one literally tells you from where to where. Okay? So that's how you'd work this. If you're familiar with Draftsman, if you don't like these things, like I don't care for the outer diameter construction, you got to do these all these in the properties. You click on columns and you just turn those off, and it will adjust it accordingly. Okay? So that's how you would add those in. And just to give you kind of I'll bring this one up because I think this one came out a little nicer here. I haven't completed it yet because there's a lot to have done during this, but you can see because I have the color codings, also I put in the bill of materials as well, but because of the color codings, you can see a little bit better. Now, with that being said, I have just found that a lot of technicians actually are colorblind. So just be careful about using colors. Sometimes you got to also just write it out, but just be aware that happens to be, at least that's been my experience in the industry. And that's the harness editor basically in a nutshell. Now, with that being said, I want to forewarn you, this is my third objective. I like doing things in threes. There's a third objective, that there are a lot of rough edges. Rough edges to me are usually inefficiencies, but there are some rough edges that I call almost bleeding rough edges here, and I want to bring them to your attention because I've done a lot of sleight of hand to make this work. Okay, in the past week, I've been kind of tap dancing around a lot of landmines to prevent things from happening, but I think they're important that I need to show those to you so that I'm not selling you on a bill of goods that will frustrate you later on. Okay? So I'm going to go back into my diagram here, and let me split the screen so we can do a little bit of comparison here. I'm going to right-click on this up here, and I'm going to say split vertical, and I'm going to bring up my project over here, the off-label one, so we have something to compare against. I'm going to drag this one on this side here. So what you see over here is this one over here. Now, in the off-label method, we were able to keep pretty much all the lines as straight as possible because we were able to move pins around. I cannot for the life of me figure out how to move pins. So if I click in P1, for example, and I go over here into the pins, and I've unlocked them, I cannot move these things. I can't grab them, I can't move them. So that forces me to draw these in such a way that they are fixed. And one of the things you're gonna always find with harnesses and cabling, there's never always a point to point. In fact, for the most part, if it's point to point, you can probably buy it off the shelf, right? The whole reason making these harnesses is to get point A to work with point B, and point A and point B are not compatible with each other. That's why you have this harness to get them to talk to each other. So this is kind of a major problem, the fact you cannot move the pins. Okay, so now I got to make the wires work here. The second issue I've come across, and this is because, and I stumbled upon this one by mistake, but it was because of the fact that I always add in a part B, right? And that part B over here is the picture. When I start moving things, whether I move P1, just the fact I did what I did here, just by clicking on it, slightly moving it, Altium will either throw these taps on here, or it will throw the splices on there. It depends on what the last thing I placed. In this case, I think I placed taps when I was demonstrating it earlier. Okay. Well, you may think to yourself, well, that's not a problem. I'll just sweep over this, okay, and I'll just delete it. It brings up a new problem. Now, if you're going to do that, you can do a Control Z, but I'm going to forewarn you, Control Z is not your friend here. It's not totally doing a Control Z. And the minute, remember, what happens here is that when those taps show up, right, and this tap is over here and over here, these become separate wires. So if I'm careful enough and I do one at a time, I can remove these. And I'll be able to back myself out of this. But what if I take this and slightly move it here? The taps come back, and they come back on both sides, so it drives you crazy. Let's say I'm frustrated, I just sweep over this thing and say to hell with it, and I hit delete. Now I've got two separate wires. Well, what have we always done in the past over on the schematic PCB side? Well, let's just delete the wire and let's run the wire again. Now, if I take this wire, now this wire here, by the way, lost its W because that was the W3, I think, here. But at least since it's straight, I can take it over here and stretch it, and I can put it there, and yet again, it puts another tap on there. That's pretty funny. Is it here or is it in here? Okay. So nevertheless, I was able to draw this here, but now I've got to fix my W. Sometimes I can't do it, and you really have to redraw it again. So I'll give you an example of this. I'm going to go back into my components, and here I'm going to do my Belden wire, which we've shown earlier, and I'm going to place it, and I'm going to drop this in. Now, the sleight of hand that I showed you guys earlier was that I took the two and I connected them together and I stretched them out. That's certainly a way to do it. But what I can do here too is if I put these up here, this will work fine. It'll stretch out, kind of, sort of. And then you deal with silly things like this. Let's do a Control Z. And by the way, if I hold down my Control key, I'll be able to separate it off. But let's say, for instance, I'm kind of old school and I'm not going to just drop it in here because I really want these things to connect in a different fashion. So if I go up into the Place menu and I go into, okay, give me a harness wire here, and I do something like this, okay, these do not meld together. And I do not know of a way to make them to meld together as one big happy thing. Really, when Altium correct me if I'm wrong, if people have used this thing, let me know if I'm on the right track or not. What I would have expected is Altium come up with a little drop-up saying that, yes, it's as part of the same wire, no, it's a separate wire, and add a splice. Okay, that's what I would expect, but this kind of becomes problematic over here. So these are the things I've found to probably be the roughest edges of it. The other documents seem to work okay, though. Again, making sure that everything that comes from this side to the layout side, I probably need to spend a little more time to see if it is bringing everything in as expected. So that's why I want to bring to your attention that the editor has its limitations. There's a few other things that came across too. You saw them earlier, like sometimes you got to take these loops here and you've got to change them in the properties so that they'll fit accordingly. So these are, again, rough edges that are, at least there's workarounds. There's one other workaround I'll mention too, that if really push comes to shove, you're like, I really need this to work here and I want to stretch this out. Let's take this wire over here. Let's say this wire did break, it did in fact break off. Let's go in there and zoom and let's delete that. Let's delete the tap here, okay? What you can do is if you click on this, fortunately in the properties, you could add another line in here, or you could figure out which segment that is and extend out the X or the Y. In this case, it'd probably be the X, and make that connect in. So you've got some mechanisms. So you're not totally painting in the corner, but you may have a rough go at things at times. And a lot of times what I found when I first designed this, save often. So if I was a good spot, I would save it. And then if I totally screwed something up, I would either bring it back up again, or I'd delete the line and say, okay, let's just redraw the line again. But again, now I've got to change all its properties. Okay. One last thing I didn't really mention, you can see that there's a lot of color coding here, and they do a pretty cool job with the coloring. I'm sorry to kind of throw it over here, but it's just kind of saw these colors and I wanted to bring it to your attention. I forgot to mention it. When you put down a wire, there are some properties it already gives you. You can change the color of that wire. If there's additional colors to it, you can go to color and say secondary or tertiary, or if it's a white one, you want to put a border on it, you can do that as well. Okay, and so by adding a secondary, for example, I can have a white and red. And so when I click off of this, you can see that you have white and a red. So there you go. And as I'm looking at my time over here, I know that I'm really pressed for it. So that's the harness editor in a nutshell. At this point, I guess I'd like to ask you a question. So I'm going to go to our next polling question here. Now that you've seen it, what do you think? Okay, so the vast majority, well, half of you said that it's just none of the above, just looking. For those who are just looking, hopefully it gave you a good taste of what we're dealing with here in the harness tool. Let me also throw this at you as well. There are other tools out there. There's E3, there's SWE, which is SolidWorks Electrical. Just keep in mind, they all got their various bugs and idiosyncrasies. So no matter where you go with it, you're going to fight something somewhere, somehow. Okay? And then those who are using the off-label method, I guess they did a good job in selling the off-label method. Those who are using the harness editor, again, I'd like to know if there's things I overlooked or I missed or some way misrepresented it. I don't want to do that. I just want to call it as it is. But hopefully maybe you found a couple of features you weren't familiar with as well. For the 3% that are going to go from the harness editor to the off-label one, I'm just going to forewarn you, you're going to have to do some library work for that. So if you can make the harness editor work, I would say you may want to continue down that path. In fact, if anything, I kind of almost want to encourage you to keep in the harness editor for no other reason than to constantly give Altium some feedback, because that's what they're looking for, right? They threw it out there. Who designed this thing? Software engineers designed it, right? The application engineers aren't making harnesses with these things over at Altium. It's us, the designers, who are making these things, and that's the feedback they're going to need to improve it. So I kind of encourage you to think twice, unless you really, really don't like if you've been dealing with the same hassles that I've been dealing with over here and you just fed up, I get it. But if you can make it work, I encourage you to do that just to provide them some better feedback. So with that, I'd like to speak a moment. Oh, I have one more question for you. And that question is, what do you think of the webinar? Okay, great, guys. Really appreciate your feedback over here. And glad that I was able to give you this information. If you don't mind, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about Altium Designer here. So I'm going to jump back into our questions here. You're here for our PowerPoint. You're here for a reason, and that was to see the harness editor in action, to see the difference between the harness editor and the off-label method and determine if either method is best for you. And you guys have made that clear through the polling. Thank you. What do we do here at 9.Connects? 3 things. We do PCB design. We really do like the quote unquote ugly stuff, the challenging stuff, the DDR, high speed, the flex. You know, if you're doing that type of stuff, you need some help, let us know. We enjoy the challenge. And, for training, we do our PCB foundations classes for anybody who just needs to understand the whole idea of the printing of basically the PCB process. And then we do our full spectrum training. This is basically Altium Designer, really great for those who are both beginners and those who even do know Altium who want to get a better use and feel for the tool. And we also do A365, so those people who are trying to make A365 better and to work for them, we can work with them as well. We do library stuff, restoration, creation, migration, and library and services as well. So if you got a library that's in tough shape and you don't have the time and energy to do it, come talk to us. The one I want to focus in on today is private training. So we do public trainings, we do private trainings. Public trainings are, we make an announcement and whoever comes to it, comes to it. We do it normally through a webinar style, you know, basically it's online. But we also do private trainings as well. In fact, we kind of like these because we find them to be a lot more powerful in training, right? So it allows for more internal conversation between people, right? Because if you're in a public training, you don't really get to meet people, especially if they're online, because everybody's kind of doing their own thing. But if you know each other and then there's a workflow issue, then you start having that conversation, which is really important because learning the tool and applying to the workforce are major elements of the training. Customized days and times that we can do it. So normally we do this in, I believe, 4 days, but if you need only do 3 days, we can do that. Some people can only do 2, and there's only certain topics they want us to cover. Online or in person, we really do like the in-person because let's face it, when you're online, it's easy to go drifting off into email or into personal work because you're always behind, right? Every designer and engineer out there is always behind. And then lastly, we can customize the topics, and here's a list of them, right? Off-label, harnessing, SVN. In fact, we just did this recently for a customer about a week ago, and then there's other things that we can do. So unlike with the public one, we just have to really follow the book because we just promise people, hey, we're gonna give you 4 days of training and this is what we're gonna cover. When it gets into the private ones, then we can cover things that a lot of people may not be interested in, but may be an interest to you and your company. So something to keep in mind if you're looking for training. And we do it for PCB foundations. We do it full spectrum training. And quite frankly, when we do our A365, it's always a private training because that's really a team effort. It's not something we can do in 3 days. We have to kind of do it over a period of time to make sure everyone's on board with each of the decisions being made. And with that, this is our presentation